On a fraying couch in a neighborhood that polished its hedges like metals, Sarah watched the light thin across a coffee table she had once set with care. The place still had the shape of a family, the small handprints on the lower window, the dent in the couch where someone used to read aloud, the matching plates stacked in the cabinet. The life those objects belonged to had, a few months ago, been given away in one quiet movement. Packing, signatures, a door closing that did not look back. Brian left. He did not raise his voice. He left in the white, efficient way of someone erasing a name with a clean rag. Neighbors nodded over fences with the practiced pity of people who keep their distance and their opinions in equal measure. Mornings brought the soft parade, joggers with earbuds, a runner pushing a stroller, mail carriers who darted like small birds. They passed her house and made the same small recalculation. This one was single now, the one the papers and casseroles would attend to, the one to gossip about in clipped backyard sentences. Sarah felt the town like a gaze, a long, quiet measuring stick that kept registering what she no longer had. Inside, the heat of two children's lives warmed a different room. Their laughter came through the hallway in short bursts, building, falling, rebuilding. She let the house hold them with her. She woke early because they needed lunches and homework checked, and a steady voice to remind them it would be okay. That voice was threadbare some mornings, but it was there. She had learned to make a face for the grocery store line that did not show the newness of the wounds. The children were small and bright, and she guarded them like lanterns in wind. One evening, while the sky bled violet and then black, someone over the picket fence said, "Poor Sarah," as if that summed everything up. The words stuck in the air like lint. She could have answered back with the small defenses of a person cataloging injustices, a retort about only knowing half a story, a pointed reminder that marriage is a private thing, but she did not. She had discovered, in the quieter, honest hours, that arguments were not her way forward. What felt more important now was to find herself in anything at all. The attic smelled the way old things smell: dust, cedar, sunlight trapped in boxes. She climbed the narrow stairs with the flashlight's cones swinging. Upstairs was cooler, a place she had avoided because it contained more of the life he'd once shared: the suitcase they had never thrown away, the framed photograph of a past vacation, the boxes labeled keepsakes in handwriting that now felt foreign. She pushed aside a cardboard and found a canvas wrapped in a towel. It was a canvas she had forgotten she had bought years ago, a small thing of blank possibility. Her hands seemed to remember before her brain did how to unwrap fabric and smooth the taut white.
There were brushes in a jar beneath the eaves, cheap synthetic ones, a pricier sable or two, stolen from a long-abandoned hobby. Tubes of paint peeked out of a shoebox, cadmium red, a stubborn ultramarine, titanium white like a promise. The smell of oil paint rose, sharp and sweet and somehow brave. She bought a palette on a whim and set it on her lap, and there, in the small roar of quiet, she mixed colors with the awkwardness of a beginner and the insistence of someone who had not spoken her name loudly in years. Her fingertips found the rhythm: dip, smear, pull, and something unclenched in her chest. The first mark was tentative, a thin streak of blue, like a held breath. Tears came without ceremony, salt cutting the paint, blurring edges. She did not try to wipe them away. The water in the brush mingled with her crying, and the blue did not mind. It drank it. She painted a small patch of sky, a suggestion of a tree, then kept going because the doing felt steadier than the waiting. Hours folded in. The attic light shifted to gold and then to lamp glow. When she climbed back down with paint on her fingers and a smear along her jaw, she carried a piece of herself she had not expected to find. Mr. Thompson noticed. He was the kind of neighbor who tended to other people's lawns when the owners were away, and who kept his hair the color of old snow. He had been a veteran, and his yard sat like a small, well-kept museum of patience. He had been the first to bring a plate of soup the week after the divorce papers were signed, and he had said nothing more than that his wife had once done a quilt for a lonely neighbor, and the neighbor had later returned the kindness. People like Mr. Thompson knew the quiet work of being present. "You paint?" he asked one afternoon, leaning on his cane at the side gate. The air had that green, first warmness of spring. He peered at the canvas propped against Sarah's porch chair, at the smear of color she had left unfinished for reasons she could not name. She shrugged. "I'm trying." He looked at the painting like somebody reading a small map. "It's honest," he said. "That's something." He did not give advice that pretended to be wisdom. He offered a fact and an invitation.
There's a little get-together next week at the community center. A few of us bring things. Not much fuss. If you ever want to show that, well, he tapped his palm gently against his chest in the gesture of a quiet man offering a small thing. People see different things than you think. Sarah laughed in a dry way that carried hope. I don't know, Mr. Thompson. I don't know if anyone wants to look at this. You'd be surprised, he said. Sometimes when a thing's been quiet for a while, it's the loudest thing in the room. That week she kept painting. The attic became a weather system of its own. Some days the paint dried in streaks. Other nights it gathered quivering in pools at the brims of the cans because she had forgotten to cap them.
Her children found her hands stained at breakfast and said, with the blunt logic of small people, "You look like a rainbow, Mom." She let them see the paint. She let them name the colors with a triumphant seriousness. "That's bravest blue," one said. "That's Mama Red," the other declared. The colors turned private hurt into a tangible thing she could touch and alter. Around the same time, Maplewood Elementary began to appear in her life in new ways. It had always been there, children marching to school with backpacks, bake sale signs, the small rituals parents perform. But now it surfaced with an edge. A flyer slipped under her door announcing meeting about budget allocations and classroom resources. The phrasing was bland. The matter it hinted at was not. Sarah had stopped attending PTA meetings since Brian left. They had been things he handled without fuss, or so she'd thought. But this time, the notice felt like an invitation she could not ignore. A parent in a carpool line, Ella, whose son loved soccer and who always had a ready smile, wavered when Sarah mentioned the meeting. "Did you hear about the after-school program?" Ella said. "They cut the art instructor. They say they're reallocating funds, but the kids in the older grades still have field trips and smartboards, while the younger kids—" Her voice fell. "We keep hearing different versions." "Different versions of what?" Sarah asked. "Who knows," Ella said. "But my niece's class is doing no art this semester. The supplies are gone. The library's hours got cut. Someone said a grant went elsewhere. It's a mess." The words landed like stones. Sarah remembered her children's small hands, the way they had once returned home with crayon drawings folded like secrets. She thought of kids who might not learn to find a language other than test scores. Her chest tightened. She had found a language in paint. What if other children did not have the chance? Ella became an unexpected conduit. She was warm and blunt and practical, the kind of person who would form a line of volunteers simply because it seemed the right thing and could not stand doing nothing. "We should ask questions," she said. "Let's go to the meeting. Even if they say there's nothing to be done, at least we'll know. And if anyone's telling us we have to sacrifice some kids so others can have it, well, that's not acceptable." The meeting at Maplewood's small multi-purpose room had folding chairs and a fluorescent light that hummed gently. Parents shuffled in, clutching phones and take-out coffee. A few had brought children who sat quietly with coloring books. There were flyers on the table, minutes from the last meeting, a budget summary with rows of numbers that looked like fields on a map you had to learn to read. A principal, an assistant, and a few district liaisons sat at the front with tired smiles. Sarah expected small talk and bleary bureaucratic phrases.
She expected the polite reassurances, the "we're looking into it," the "these are complicated decisions." What she did not expect was the narrowness of some explanations. "We reallocated discretionary funds. We streamlined transportation costs. We prioritized test-focused programs." Words arrived like thin blankets. Some people were reassured, others left shivering. At break, Sarah drifted close to a bulletin board pinned with photos of classroom projects. There, tucked behind a paper with clip art of apples, was an invoice photocopy someone had taped up, dates, line items, and odd transfer listed under program support. Her fingers, coated in the faint residue of blue smear from that morning's painting, traced the lines. The numbers began to look like questions she could not yet articulate. There was no smoking gun on that paper, only hints, inconsistencies, a parent's note jotted in the margin. "Why is this blank for arts?" She raised her hand and asked a question no one wanted to answer easily. "Can you tell us what happened to the art funding last year?" she said, voice even but steady. The principal smiled with expert diplomacy. "Budget decisions are made after a lot of deliberation," he said. "We do our best to meet the priorities of the district and the students." "And who decides priorities?" Sarah pressed. A murmur passed across the room. Parents shifted in their seats. That's when her chest unclenched into anger, not the kind that roars, but the kind that settles into a precise, cool shape. It felt dangerous and necessary, and for the first time in months, clear. If the teachers could not answer plainly, someone else would have to ask. Afterwards, in the parking lot, a small group of parents huddled by their cars,
elbows touching like a chain of small supports. Emma, who had been a committee member for years, and who moved with the quiet of someone who organized the world into lists and boxes, looked at Sarah with a frankness that didn't soften. "You ask the question they didn't want to answer," she said. "That matters. Also, if you're thinking about it, a lot of parents are. You're not alone." That was a dangerous sentence. You're not alone. It carried relief like a tide. Sarah felt it pull at the edges of her solitude. She thought of her paintings drying in the attic like small flags. She thought of Mr. Thompson's quiet insistence that the loudest things are often the quietest. She thought of her children and their small, unspoken claims to a life with color. The next evening, Sarah brought one of her canvases to a neighborhood potluck at the community center. It was small, a public space with an old piano and worn linoleum, bright with bulletin boards. She set the painting on an easel behind the tables of food, a canvas she had almost not finished, a busy wash of colors that reached toward an implied horizon. People murmured around her, and a few stopped to look.
Thompson stood beside her with the polite pride of a parent showing off a child. "It's beautiful," Ella said, turning the canvas to catch a better light. "You should put your name on that." Sarah wanted to deflect. She wasn't ready to accept accolades like armor. But then the room shifted. Conversations dropped into small silence. A woman in her 60s stood forward, eyes bright. "This looks like how it feels," she said. "I don't mean to get dramatic, but there's truth here." The art made something room-sized happen. Strangers softened, and the kitchen of the community center felt smaller in the best way, like a room that could hold concentration. People began to share, in small confessions, the things they were tired of, the way the sidewalk hadn't been fixed for years, the way the library hours were dwindling, the inconsistency of after-school programs. The complaints were not separate, they braided together like a net. That night, someone suggested forming a committee to ask the district more questions about Maplewood's budget. The idea traveled quickly and found a rhythm. Emma offered to draft a petition, Ella volunteered to call other parents, Mr. Thompson promised to show up at meetings. For the first time since the house had become a quieter place to sleep, Sarah felt the steady current of people moving toward a purpose she did not have to invent alone. But not all currents run smooth. The first meeting to organize parents at the community center drew a larger crowd. Some came because they were curious, some because they thought it was their civic duty. A few came ready to dispute. There were parents who trusted the district and others who feared rocking the boat. Sarah sat near the front with her hands folded to keep them from trembling. The room hummed with the small noises of people arranging themselves, the rustle of paper, the scrape of chairs. Halfway through, a man who had not spoken in the early small talk rose, face tight. "We're making a fuss about things that are," he began, and his voice snagged on a word that was meant to quiet. Another woman snapped, "Someone's got to make the fuss, maybe." The conversation curled in a direction neither gentle nor productive. Tension swelled and there was the sense of a train about to lurch off track. Sarah felt the old reflex to shrink, to smooth things over with a joke or a compromise so mild it would leave everything unchanged. But the paint on her hands that morning felt like an emblem. She remembered the smear across her jaw where tears had fallen into pigment and become something she could hold. The room was full of parents who were for the most part not reckless people. They had mortgages and jobs and small necessary rituals, yet fear and fatigue had been allowing something to go unchallenged. If she did not speak, who would? She raised her hand. It was a small thing, one pale hand in a room of many. The hush that followed was not cinematic, it was practical, like a shared intake of breath that said they were listening. She spoke with the quiet that sometimes carries more weight than a shout. "I don't have inside information," she said. "I have a kid who loves to draw. I have neighbors who tell me their children don't have the same chances. I have a stack of invoices and notes that don't make sense to me. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's an accounting line that looks worse than it is. But we owe it to our kids to be sure, to ask and to ask again if we need to." Her voice was plain. It did not shove, it invited. Some of the parents nodded. A few looked away. A woman in the back muttered, "Is this really worth?" And then, seeing the faces around her, shrugged and stayed quiet. Emma took a small folder from her bag and slid it toward the center table. Inside were copies of a simple petition draft, questions to the district, request. A few heads turned. Some grew stiff. He wore a coat that fit like it had been constructed to look untroubled. He moved through the room with the little ease of someone accustomed to having conversations where he shaped them. He stood at the back of the folding chairs and watched. When he finally spoke, it was to someone within earshot of Sarah. "Making art is fine," he said,
But won't you be better served by focusing on stability? The kids need a stable home more than a painting class. It was a small barb, delivered with the precision of someone who had practiced undercutting without rage. A few people looked toward Sarah with expressions that flickered between curiosity and complicit understanding. The comment was not new. Brian had always had the way of folding a judgment into an ostensibly helpful observation. He did not have to raise his voice to make his point known. Sarah felt old habits flare, defensiveness, the desire to justify. The room seemed to tilt between pity and the assumed expertise of his voice. But something inside her had shifted since the attic. Her hands remembered the paint, the slow rightness of creating, bargaining with it. "Stability isn't a zero-sum thing," she said instead, without turning to face him. "Kids deserve art and math and a home that works. They deserve us asking questions when things don't add up." A murmured agreement rose near the front. Mr. Thompson gave a small, discreet nod. Ella, who had been standing beside her, laid a hand on her shoulder with steady solidarity.
Brian's mouth thinned. He shifted his weight, and then, with a dry laugh that brushed sarcasm, he walked away. He had not threatened, not in a public way, but his presence had calibrated the room. Some parents retreated a little, their fear of community divisions manifesting as quietness. The meeting continued. They made phone trees and set dates. They agreed to send a formal request for detailed budgets and to ask for a public accounting at the next district board meeting. The language was careful. No accusations, only demands for clarity. Actions were listed, volunteers assigned. A small committee emerged out of the fold of the meeting. Ella, Emma, Mr. Thompson, a few teachers who had come in support, and Sarah. Walking home that night, rain started, not thunderous but insistent, tapping the world into a rhythm. The air smelled like wet pavement and the faint, bright mineral smell that rain makes when it first touches dry earth. It felt like the kind of rain that could clean things if allowed to do its work. It felt like reality arriving. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and let the drops bead on her sleeves. For some people, rain is an end. For others, a beginning. The droplets on her hands slid into the creases of paint still under her fingernails and made tiny, iridescent smears. At home, the children slept. They had been exhausted from their small adventures of the day. She stood by the nursery door and watched them breathe, small and undisturbed. The thought that had taken root in her since the meeting had nothing to do with publicity or victory. It had to do with voice. Hers, theirs, the collective voice of parents who decided to refuse powerlessness. The canvases in the attic were no longer only therapy. They were artifacts of a person rehearsing courage. She slept a little that night, dreaming in varnished color. In the morning, the neighborhood looked the same trimmed hedges, the same mailboxes, but the shape of her days had shifted. Change, she had learned, does not demand storms at once. Sometimes it began with a question asked in a fluorescent-lit room. Sometimes it started with a neighbor's quiet invitation. Sometimes it started with paint on fingertips. Over the next weeks, the small committee turned into something with a schedule. They made lists. Who would call the district office? Who would request the invoices? Who would tabulate the data into forms that bureaucrats might recognize? Emma taught Sarah how to write a public records request without sounding accusatory, and how to phrase questions in ways that demanded answers. Ella organized coffee mornings where parents could sign petitions quietly and leave. Mr. Thompson made sure their meetings had a pot of hot tea and a steady anchoring presence, saying little and doing the thing that matters most in grassroots movements, showing up. Momentum, at first, felt like an improvised thing. People showed up at different times with different urgencies. The high school teacher who had been shifted to work in 2 schools, the volunteer who ran the after-school program, a young father who had helped on a make-a-play day. They were not professionals. They were people with burdens and jobs and kids who could not stay late. Still, the gatherings produced work, spreadsheets of supplies, a list of missing positions, a timeline of when programs had been reduced. Someone found that certain line items had shifted in a way that raised more questions than answers, and the committee turned those questions into a letter to the district. There were setbacks. A reporter they hoped might listen passed on the story, saying it was small-town stuff and not a headline. A parent withdrew their signature from the petition after receiving a threatening message about making waves. One of the teachers, who had whispered to Sarah that she feared reprisals if she spoke up, disappeared from the committee's calls without explanation. The small things eroded morale in quiet ways. Each time, Sarah learned to steady the group by reminding them of the small stakes they were not willing to accept. Workshops canceled, classes left bare, kids pushed toward tests when they needed art to breathe. Through it all, Sarah returned to the attic when she could. Painting had become a place where she processed decisions. There were canvases that felt raw and incomplete, brushstrokes showing anger in an abrupt way, others that were gentle with color, almost like apologies to herself. The art served as both record and rehearsal. Mr. Thompson sometimes came to see what she'd made, and he would nod as if the pieces affirmed something he already knew, that naming a thing is the first step in changing it. Then the rumor started. It appeared first as a whisper in an online parent group, someone claiming to have seen an internal email referencing a reallocation of funds. No author attached their name. The rumor widened and thinned like a spill, leaving both stains and questions. People began to say the words impropriety and mismanagement in corners, careful to phrase them as speculation. Sarah felt a prickle of worry. Rumor can become wind. Wind can knock down structures, and not always the ones that deserve it. She had seen how quickly truth and noise could braid into a rope strong enough to strangle the cause. In a phone call late one night, Emma's voice was taut. "We need to be careful," she said. "If this is true, we need evidence. If it's not, we can't let it become gossip. Either way, we proceed with our written requests and the meeting. Facts. Facts are all we have." Sarah agreed. She had no taste for theatrics. The work they were doing was about facts for the sake of children who deserved a routine of play and exploration, not the bearing of neighborhood grievance for sport.
The difference between a cause and a crusade, she realized, is often the steadiness you bring when noise threatens to overwhelm. At the next organizing meeting, the room filled with new faces and a tremor of anticipation. Parents spoke in turns, some with trembling voices, some with practical checklists. Someone suggested a public comment period at the next district meeting. Another person recommended inviting a local charity that ran arts programs to partner with Maplewood so the kids would not lose out while the paperwork sorted itself. The energy was quiet and purposeful, like the hands of people knitting something sturdy. But the undercurrent of fear remained. The man who had mocked them at the first meeting had not returned, but his voice echoed in others who feared division. Sarah learned to name the fears out loud in the room: fear of retribution, fear of being labeled troublesome, fear of making their children collateral in an adult fight. Naming it helped. It leashed it. On a windy afternoon that smelled of rain, the committee arranged to distribute flyers at the school pickup line. They stood with clipboards and pens under the shelter of an awning as the sky began to bruise. Parents came by, some signing in a rush, others lingering a moment to ask mundane questions and then adding their names. A few passed with only a glance. A child held a paper cutout sun, still shiny with glue, and looked up at Sarah with a hope that had no calculus. She crouched to the child's height and asked about the drawing. The little boy explained, with the solemnity children give to their worlds, that his class had colored an ocean and painted boats, but had been unable to add the sky because there were no blue paint pots left. Sarah folded that small complaint into her body. The problem, which might have been made into a spreadsheet and a board resolution, had a face. It had the shape of a child who wanted a sky. By the time the rain started to fall in earnest, the flyer distribution had gathered momentum. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the committee now passed with curious glances. The sound of muffled conversation and the slap of rain against sidewalks made a rushed soundtrack of community. Under umbrellas and hastily tied plastic bags, parents continued to sign. And then, as the crowd thinned, someone let out a frustrated exclamation. A stack of flyers at the front of a carport had been soaked through by a sudden gust that had blown a plastic container over. The ink ran into smudges, names starting to bleed like watercolor. It was a small, ridiculous disaster, yet it felt apt, a symbol that in this work you would always risk losing what you had built to the weather, to chance. They laughed in a brittle way at their wet papers, because laughter is a necessary salve, and they retrieved what they could. When Sarah arrived home that night, her hair damp and her shoes splattered with mud, she carried a small hope and a hollowed worry. Brian had not liked the committee. He had called once, voice brisk and practical, to suggest she was overextending herself. "Don't make this about you," he had said. The sentence landed like something old. But the world she inhabited had shifted. What felt personal now was public duty. The thing she'd been fearing, becoming the woman of backyard rumor, had already happened in others' eyes. She had to choose whether to let that define her. She climbed the attic stairs and stood for a moment with her hand on the banister, breathing the house's slow night breath. The canvases leaned like patient witnesses. She picked up a brush and loaded it with midnight blue paint. The first stroke was a line that curved into a horizon. She added a smear of brighter color, and then a small, fierce dot of yellow, like a distant lamp. The painting was not finished. It might never be. but it held something that felt like a promise, not a guarantee of victory, but the knowledge that she could stand in the center of a moment and not be swept away. A week later, the committee organized its first public appearance, a town hall-style meeting scheduled at the district office. They had called parents by phone, distributed sign-up forms, and written a careful agenda. They had rehearsed the questions. When did the allocations change? By what process? Who authorized transfers? What safeguards existed to protect classroom programming? They intended to be polite and persistent. The plan was to ask and to keep asking until they received answers. On the morning of the meeting, a storm sat offshore like a gathering thought. The wind hooked itself into the gutters and made the trees bend. Sarah felt a strange calm watching the weather line move. Rain can be a test. It can make people stay home, retreat, decide the world is too wet to venture into. It can thin crowds and dilute momentum. Or it can be the element that forces the brave to show up. The district office had a kind of corporate brightness, glass doors, a lobby with polished floors. A handful of parents trickled in, damp coats clinging to their shoulders. Inside, the air smelled of paper and the faint antiseptic of cleanliness. Sarah noticed, as she sat down, a woman at a nearby table leafing through a stack of documents with a practiced eye. She introduced herself as a parent who also volunteered at the library. She offered to stay through the meeting as a witness, quietly observing. These were the small alliances that made a group feel less like a band of anxious parents and more like a civic body. At the appointed hour, the meeting room doors opened. District officials entered with the neutral faces of people who have attended many public meetings. The atmosphere was formal but contained. Chairs filled, time was kept.
Sarah's heart drummed the way it does before speaking in public, a small, steady percussion that both anchored and irritated. The first question came from a father who used data like a defense. He asked for the numbers. Someone else asked for the documented timeline of program changes. The officials provided measured, careful replies. Some things were said in half-answers, protective phrases that sounded like policy speak. The group listened and took notes. Then Brian appeared. Again, not with a dramatic entrance, but with the kind of social immunity some people possess. He sat near the back, his coat dripping from the rain, and he watched. When he stood to speak, it was not to the board, but to a parent nearby, in a tone loud enough for half the room to hear. "You're making a scene," he said, meaning to be both a warning and a correction. The language assumed entitlement. It assumed that there was a center and that problems could be managed by those who already defined the perimeter. The comment landed like a small challenge. For a second, Sarah felt the old scripts reel her inward. Then a woman 2 rows ahead, who had been quietly cataloging the district's statements, rose and said calmly, "We're not making a scene. We're asking to be heard." The woman's voice was even but firm. It had the effect of a bell sound in the room, clear, audible, impossible to ignore. The meeting proceeded. The officials promised to look into discrepancies and to provide some additional documents, but the words were cautious and the timeline vague. The group left with mixed feelings. They had not been rebuffed entirely. They had not been given full accounting. There was work to do, follow-ups, legal phrasing for records requests, the building of an evidence trail. Outside, the rain had turned to a steady sheet. Under awnings, parents huddled in small groups. Conversations overlapped, plans for the next public comment, the drafting of a formal letter to the district's oversight committee, the idea of inviting a local journalist to cover the issue. Sarah felt a fatigue in her limbs that was not purely physical, the sort that settles like sediment after long days of carrying the world's weight in your hands and redistributing it gently. That evening, in the dim of her kitchen, she held a stack of documents, copies of minutes, a small memo from a local PTA board, a photocopy someone had taken of a line item that looked like it had been shifted. The pieces were not a puzzle yet. They were a smear of questions. But for the first time since the attic, she did not feel inclined to fold the papers and tuck them away. Instead, she laid them on the table like a map and began to organize them. A knock came at the door. It was Mr. Thompson, umbrella dripping, eyes bright. He stepped inside like someone bringing sun into a shaded room. "I thought you might like some company," he said. They sat at the table with tea and the quiet business of neighbors. "You're doing the right thing," he said, unadorned. "Asking is the simplest form of stewardship." As they talked, Sarah felt herself inching toward a place she had not expected to occupy, the center of a conversation that mattered to more than her own household. She had entered the work because of her children, and because a desire to reclaim herself had taken the shape of a brush. Now those two trajectories braided into one, the personal act of reclaiming voice and the civic act of demanding fairness. Late that night, rain pattered on the windows and made a steady, soft percussion. She rose to look at the canvases leaning against the wall, the ones that had gotten her through nights of loneliness, and the ones that now seemed wired into a public life she had not planned. In the wet streetlight, the paint shimmered. She reached out and smudged a bit of cobalt onto her fingertip, tasting it like a small, private benediction. She did not yet know the shape of the fight ahead. She did not know if the district would respond with grace or defense, if the leak she'd heard whispered about would become a flood, or if the small committee would hold together under pressure. She knew only that the first firm step had been taken. Questions asked, people mobilized, a voice found. When the phone rang later that week, she answered with a tempered, focused voice. The caller introduced herself as a teacher from another school in the district who had also noticed strange reallocations of supplies. She had documents and was willing to share them, but she feared being revealed as the source. The voice on the other end was careful, like someone holding a small, hot coal. "You're not alone," the teacher said, echoing what Ella had said in the parking lot weeks ago. The words landed like a blessing and a burden. Sarah arranged a meeting. They chose a cafe by the park with a noise level that allowed for privacy and a bench where the rain would not dissolve a conversation. On the morning of the rendezvous, the sky looked as if it could break at any moment. A wind had settled the leaves into jittery procession. She took the stairs two at a time, hands slightly trembling, the way an actor will before stepping into a role for the first time. Her palms still bore the faint residue of paint. At the cafe, the teacher, young, determined, always on the brink of exhaustion, handed Sarah a photocopy. The paper felt ordinary in her hands, but the content hummed like a hidden machine. It showed patterns, sudden program cuts in certain years, shifts in vendor contracts, timing that coincided with the reassignment of extracurricular grants. The photocopy did not accuse anyone by name. It simply showed lines that did not align with the stories parents had been told. "You have to be careful," the teacher said. "If you put this out there without a trail of facts, it could turn the whole thing into noise."
People get hurt by rumors more than they do by cold paperwork. Sarah folded the photocopy into her palm and felt its thinness like the edge of a blade. She knew the difference between spectacle and stewardship now. She also knew the risk of hesitation. The committee needed evidence, yes, but the teacher's voice had the weary urgency of someone who had watched systems shuffle truths into corners where they could never be found again. "We'll be careful," Sarah said. "We'll do it by the book. We'll make sure the people who can answer are asked in a way they have to answer." They met at the little cafe near the park where the coffee was always lukewarm and the barista knew to keep the owner's tab open for teachers. The teacher tapped the photocopy with a finger, pointing out lines that had the same vendor name recurring, the same month where multiple small grants had been repurposed into a single account. Nothing screamed corruption, nothing named names. It was a map of oddities and inconsistencies that invited curiosity. Back at home, Sarah laid the photocopies across her kitchen table like the bones of a small animal, a structure you could learn to read if you wanted it to speak. She called Emma and Ella and they made a plan. Formal records requests drafted, witnesses identified, a modest media outreach strategy that emphasized facts over fury. They agreed to share documents among themselves, to keep a log of every call and email, and to insist on public timelines from the district. They also agreed on something else, to keep painting in the margins. It was a private contract, a ritual. When the nights grew heavy, when angry comments scrawled across social feeds like graffiti, Sarah would climb to the attic and let color do what rhetoric could not. The canvases were not propaganda, they were truth-telling in the honest language of color. A week later, something ugly and precise arrived, an anonymous social post that spread faster than anyone could catch. It claimed that the Parents' Committee had been funneling donations into personal accounts, that signatures had been forged, that the activists at Maplewood were making money off the backs of children. The post was a mosaic of innuendo, screenshots taken out of context, a blurred photocopy with a note scribbled in the margin, someone's old volunteer roster. It read like a smear job because it was built like one. Within hours, private messages began to seep into the group chat, friends who asked cautiously, a parent who said they heard rumors, a teacher who begged the group to pause. One of the older volunteers, rattled, texted to withdraw her name from volunteer hours until the mess calmed. Someone posted a snide comment on the community board. Maybe some people should mind their own paint. Brian called, that cool cadence in his voice sharpened with concern that smelled of calculation. Maybe you should step back, he said. Let the people who know how to run things deal with it.
Rumor has gravity. It bends towards certainty. The committee felt its weight. They could have dissolved under the small pressure of social accusation, withdrawals and silence, and walked back into their quieter, more private grief. Instead, they did what they always promised to do. They leaned into facts. Emma organized a public timeline and a page of annotated documents that explained what they had and what they did not have. Ella made phone calls to parents who hadn't yet signed, not to persuade, but to explain. Mr. Thompson came to every meeting with a thermos of tea and the kind of patience that works like ballast when a boat lists. Sarah wrote a clear statement. We are a group of parents asking for transparency. We have not and will not accept donations into private accounts. We will cooperate with any inquiry. The language was plain, legal enough to remove loopholes, but human enough to be believed. They put it on the community bulletin and emailed it to everyone who had attended meetings. They also took a step that felt both brave and small. They posted, on a public page, scanned copies of the requests they had filed and a log of who had donated what, and a short note asking anyone who had genuine evidence of wrongdoing to bring it forward to the proper oversight authorities. Transparency as a practice, Sarah had learned, was not just about hiding nothing. It was about refusing the shadows where lies like to breed. The backlash did not evaporate overnight. A local blog that thrived on neighborhood gossip ran a breathless piece with a headline that implied scandal. An old friend of Sarah's, someone who had always known Brian and had, for reasons of her own, kept a hand near both households, left a comment under the piece that hinted Sarah had been making scenes to win sympathy. A few parents who were already nervous retreated to their porches and kept their names off petitions for fear of social cost. Then came the vandalism. Flyers left outside the community center were torn and smeared. Someone had scrawled an accusation on a banner with permanent marker. The rain came that night, hard, insistent, washing ink into webs and making the torn flyers curl like dead leaves. It felt like a weather system had acquired its own moral judgment, punishing those who dared lift their voices. Sarah stood at the community center door, hands shoved into her coat pockets, watching the paper float in puddles. They could have canceled the next public appearance. They could have folded and let the night be the victor. Instead, they gathered under umbrellas, not to stage a counterattack, but to show up. Parents who had been afraid because their jobs did not afford reputational risk came anyway. People brought candles and umbrellas and signs that were mottled by rain and still resolute. Mr. Thompson, who walked with a cane and whose hair looked like the color of a winter sky, held a candle steady in his palm.
The light wavered under the storm, but did not go out. Sarah found herself in the center of a small ring of people who seemed to have decided that silence was more dangerous for their children than a little social discomfort. They spoke, quietly, about the kids who painted imaginary skies on scrap paper and about the teachers who had run from the fuss of budget meetings for fear of being blamed. They listened. The vigil was not a victory, it was a refusal to be bullied into invisibility. When the vigil broke up, wet and shivering, someone had left a typed note pinned to the center door. "We will watch you." The words were old as fear. They were intended to steal strength. They did not. The leak, the anonymous post, the smear, the vandalism, was a test. Tests don't always have clear pass-fail margins. For Sarah, passing it meant doing the slow, steady work of fact-gathering and refusing to be drawn into defensive showmanship. It also meant showing people how to be courageous together. She sat up late that night with a notebook and a pen and wrote, "Call the local oversight office, request digital timestamps, list witnesses, map every public document." She circled phrases and drew arrows, and then, in the quieter margin, wrote the line Mr. Thompson had said weeks before, "Sometimes the quietest things are the loudest in the room." A week later, there was another push to publicize the story widely. A reporter from a small regional outlet called, asking if the committee would be willing to be interviewed. Sarah felt the familiar itch. Every media call risks twisting the shape of a story. They decided to accept, but only on their terms. The interview would focus on their documents, their requests, and the children's needs, rather than on the rumor cycles. The reporter nodded to the parameters and came with a list of questions about what the parents were asking for. She listened carefully and seemed to understand that in small towns, mistakes could be corrected without spectacle if the right steps were taken. The inquiry process moved slow, as any bureaucracy does. The district promised to look into the invoices and to provide more detailed line items. They scheduled a time for a public comment at a district meeting 2 weeks out. That timeline was not a guarantee of accountability. It was a procedure. Still, it was a door opening a crack. In the week before the district meeting, tensions mounted. Brian called more often. He attended a neighborhood breakfast with a few known allies and asked pointed questions, the kind that inflamed suspicion more than it soothed. He said once, almost offhandedly, "Be careful who you trust," as if trust itself were a fragile vase he could break with a look. His tone carried the old delineation, the one he had always preferred, where he set the terms and others accepted them. But he also had friends on the school board. The reminder was not subtle.
Sarah could have let his presence be a rerun of what had been, quiet permission-seeking, a deferral of decisions to his judgment. Instead, she stepped up. She began attending strategy sessions and practicing her opening remarks in the mirror, not to perform, but to anchor her voice. She visited classrooms, not to grandstand, but to listen. Her canvases kept drying in the attic, pigments arranged like a chorus of tiny testimonies. There was a moment, a small private scene that changed the course of how she encountered Brian. He reached out to arrange a meeting, to clear the air. She agreed and suggested they meet at a coffee shop not far from the park, neutral territory, bustling enough to keep things civil. He arrived in a rain-dark jacket, his hair damp, a silhouette of the man who had left without a slammed door. He sat down and looked at her with a face that had always had the ease of someone used to being heard. "People are talking," he said, cutting quickly to the point that had been a lever in his pockets for years. "It's bad for the kids. Maybe you should stop. The more you push, the more you make this about you." For a second, Sarah felt all the old scripts scroll across her mind. Placate, minimize, compromise. She thought of the couch in the living room with the worn dent, the one that used to mean a steady hand and a steady voice. She thought of the attic and the first blue mark she had pulled across canvas like a held breath. She thought of the child who had not had blue paint to finish an ocean. "I'm not doing this for me," she said. "I'm doing it for the kids." Her voice was small, but it had a new freight to it. Care without permission, determination without malice. "And if you think this is about attention, you're looking at it wrong. This is about accountability. It's about making sure resources meant for classrooms are actually used there." Brian's face, which had been composed, showed a flinch. He tried a different tactic, the one he used when persuasion by logic failed, charm. "You know I want what's best for them too," he said. "I just think you're putting yourself out there in ways that make our family a spectacle." "You left," she said. The word was not a confrontation so much as an observation. "You left, and I stayed." He stared at that, a paused beat where the history of them hung thinly between two people who had once shared pronouns and photographs. "We can still manage this privately," he offered, the offer shaped like control. "No," Sarah said. "We can't. Not when children's programs are losing their supplies. Not when the decision-making affects a whole generation of kids. This isn't about privacy. It's about public responsibility." He tried to pivot again, question motive, imply chaos, and when he did, Sarah felt the old urge to explain, to heal his discomfort with a story that would fit neatly in his hands. Instead, she leaned forward and said simply, "I don't need your permission to be a parent."
"I don't need your permission to fight for my children's classroom. If you have concerns, bring them to the committee. We'll listen, but we won't be silenced by insinuation." They left the coffee shop with both of them slightly damp from rain and carrying different things. Brian went back into the rain with the look of a man who expected others to fall in line. Sarah walked home beneath a sky that had been scrubbed by weather and felt a quiet steadiness settle into her shoulders like a new coat she'd chosen for herself. The town hall district meeting arrived on a day that was brilliant and cold, the kind of sun that reveals everything with a white, blind honesty. Inside the boardroom, rows of chairs filled with faces from the neighborhood, parents with petitions, teachers with photocopied calendars, an older woman with a box of student drawings. Sarah arrived early, clutching a folder of documents that included the photocopies the teacher had given her, the annotated timeline Emma had assembled, and a small stack of letters from parents whose children had lost art time. They were not there to demand a headline. They were there to ask questions in public and to show that a community would not let the thing that made their children more whole be quietly dismantled. When it came time for public comment, the room filled with those small human nudges that make municipal spaces feel less bureaucratic and more human. A child's crayon picture held up by a proud parent, an elderly neighbor who spoke about the town's long history of shared responsibility. Sarah went later in the queue. She felt the flutters of nerves like a drum roll. She began slow. She spoke of paint on fingertips and crayon suns. She spoke of spreadsheets and invoices, plain facts, but also of the human consequence when a program disappears, a child who never learns to name a feeling except as a right or a wrong answer. "We are asking for clarity," she said. "We are asking for the records that explain how and why funds moved. We are asking you to make decisions in daylight." Her voice held, not brittle but resolute. Around her, parents nodded. A few people in the room looked uncomfortable as their own assumptions came under the light. The district responded with the measured language of institutions. They would examine records. They would appoint someone to gather the documents. They would respond within a given time frame. It was not an admission. It was not a victory.
It was, in bureaucratic terms, movement. When she stepped down, people clustered around. A journalist from the regional outlet wanted to ask a few follow-ups, and a teacher slipped her a note that said simply, "Thank you." Outside the building, the air smelled like melted snow and the reluctant promise of spring. They had done the work to get there, and it had mattered. The leak had failed to strangle them. It had instead pushed them to build a record and a public presence.
The district's promise to look had not fixed everything, but it had created a space where questions could live without being shouted down. From there, the movement took on more shape. The committee organized a community rally at the school a fortnight later, not a frenzied protest, but a demonstration of the kind that showed a town's capacity to care. They painted a banner over weeks in the attic, Sarah and the kids adding handprints between brushstrokes, parents bringing jars of paint and smocks. The banner read, not as demand, but as promise, "Children need color." It was both art and declaration. On the morning of the rally, clouds massed and the sky threatened rain. They had planned for weather: tents, volunteers, coffee, and umbrellas. A crowd gathered: parents with strollers, teachers with boxes of student work, volunteers from a local community arts group who offered to teach a block of sessions if funding lagged. Local musicians played a soft set, and a few neighborhood children performed a clumsy but earnest line of a song about the sky. At one point, the rain came. Not the angry, erasing kind, but a steady, honest rain that turned the banner into a living thing, the colors running like tears and then drying into new patterns. People laughed and cheered despite getting wet. The weather, which earlier had felt like an enemy, now felt like a witness. The crowd refused to be erased by small annoyances. Under dripping umbrellas, they placed art and petitions and their presence in a line that made the school steps look, for a moment, luminous. Brian was there in the crowd, his face a study of composure that quickly dissolved into discomfort when he saw how many people had come. He lingered at the periphery, attempting a kind of presence that was intended to assert his ownership over the narrative. But the scene swallowed him. He could be present and he could watch. It did not give him control. Sarah saw him for a moment and met his gaze, and the look she returned was not a challenge, but a clarity of someone who had stopped seeking permission. When she stepped up to speak, the rain slowed to a drizzle and then stopped, as if the weather wanted to afford her a breath of space. She did not declaim grand solutions. She told stories of a child who had asked for blue, of a teacher who kept art supplies in her trunk, of a neighbor who mended a torn poster. She spoke of digging through records and of late-night phone calls with teachers too frightened to speak for fear of reprisal. She asked for accountability. She asked for the simple human decency of clarity. Her speech landed between the practical and the poetic because she let both live in the same breath. It was not a demand for vengeance. It was a plea for the routines that make childhood steady. The crowd responded with noise. Applause, the clapping of small hands, a chorus of voices that said, without shaping it into an ultimatum, that they would not let their children's lives be narrowed to test scores alone. The district representatives watched from the edge of the rally, noting the number of people in attendance and the clear articulation of grievances. For a moment, the civic world that often moves like a reluctant glacier seemed to feel the pressure of a tide. They took notes. They promised meetings and timelines and some immediate interim support, volunteer-led art sessions, an initial audit of disputed line items, and the scheduling of a follow-up oversight meeting. It was not revolution. It was not absolute reform. It was, however, movement, a set of actions that showed the community could muster public pressure without spectacle. In the weeks that followed, practical things happened. A small local arts nonprofit agreed to partner with the school to run an after-school program while the district's audit continued. A crowdfunding drive organized by parents raised enough to buy paint and brushes for a semester. Teachers who had been silent began slowly to voice small corroborations, offering timelines and receipts that fit the committee's questions. The district produced more documents, not all of which answered everything, but enough to keep the trail moving forward. The leak that had threatened to topple them never produced evidence against the committee. The anonymous smear faded under the weight of transparency and the active presence of a community determined to be seen. Some neighbors who had once gossiped at the fence came to events with skepticism softened into cautious support. Others remained distant, their judgments fixed. The work continued regardless, a daily, unglamorous insistence that children's access to art be more than an afterthought. For Sarah,
The changes were as much internal as external. She continued to go to the attic. She painted banners with the kids and taught them how to mix a color that might be called bravest blue. Her canvases changed texture. There was a patience in them now, the kind that comes from repeated practice and from being called to witness something larger than grief. She sold a piece at a small neighborhood fundraiser that helped fund the art supplies for 3 classrooms. The buyer was a woman who had once said, "Poor Sarah," over the fence. She came to the show with a sober apology and a check. Sarah accepted both with the pragmatic grace of someone who had learned the value of mending beyond the neatness of moral reckoning. A few months later, the committee's efforts yielded a meeting where the district made a public commitment to a review process, to increase transparency about resource allocation, and to exploring partnerships that could stabilize programming. The language, of course, was careful. The district did not admit to malfeasance.
It promised steps and timelines instead. For Sarah and the community, that was enough to keep moving. The verification of full systemic reform was, as the DNA had suggested, an ongoing struggle. But the promise was a lever, and levers, when enough people pull, can change things. The epilogue of their work did not read like a fairy tale of restored domestic bliss. There was no cinematic return of a vanished spouse with remorse and restitution. There was something more plausible, a slow accumulation of small wins. The after-school program resumed through a collaboration with the nonprofit. A new volunteer taught watercolor on Thursdays. A parent-run committee instituted a simple annual audit to be shared publicly. The district agreed to publish a budget summary in plain language and to host an annual town hall dedicated to arts and enrichment. The leak's initial damage, the smear, the vandalism, the nights of worrying about reputational harm, left its marks. People still occasionally muttered behind hands. But the community had become better at answering suspicions with documents, at offering public evidence rather than private whispers. Sarah's life, in other terms, had been reconstructed. She was still a mother who cleaned lunchboxes and checked homework, whose mornings were filled with the small arithmetic of family life. But the shape of her days included meetings, canvases, and a steady presence at committee tables. She learned to say no when time was precious, and she learned to ask for help when she needed it. She learned that dignity is not the absence of scars. It's the way you hold them while you keep building. One late afternoon, she sat on the couch, not the fraying couch of the past, but a couch with a patch Mr. Thompson had sewn on with dull, patient stitches. It was not a new couch. It was a repaired thing, as practical and honest as the life she now led. On the coffee table, next to a stack of committee notes, lay a small framed photo, her children with paint on their cheeks, grins smeared in color. Her hands were stained with a faint dusting of ochre from the day's painting session. She watched light fall across the room and felt something like peace. It was not a triumphant trumpet. It was the steady, warm certainty of someone who had rebuilt her voice. Months later, the school hosted a modest art exhibition in the gym. The floor was covered in tarps, and the smell of acrylic and glue warmed the room. Parents and neighbors moved through the rows of student work, finger-painted suns, collaborative murals, a small installation made from recycled school supplies. Sarah's canvases hung near the back, their edges still showing the fingerprints of late-night revisions. People stopped and looked. A teacher hugged her. Mr. Thompson, with a modest grin, told her he had told the neighborhood all along that she had something worth seeing. The committee continued to meet, sometimes in person and sometimes through a thread of messages.
They planned a small fundraiser that raised enough for a year of community art nights in the school gym. They wrote letters to the district and received letters back that signaled a willingness to engage. None of it wiped clean the months of solitude or rewrote the past. None of it was miraculous in the sense of overturning systems overnight. What it was, and what made it matter, was that a woman who had lost almost everything found a voice and used it to build something that outlived her pain. On a summer evening, Sarah took the kids to a block party that had grown out of their rallies, a neighborhood celebration that started as a way to raise funds and had become a place to mark the small changes. Children ran around with painted faces, chalk hearts decorating sidewalks, parents leaning on lawn chairs, trading recipes and advice. Brian was not there. Sometimes not all actors have a role in the revised script of a life. Sarah sat on a bench and watched her children chase one another with a ribbon. She felt the threads of her days pull taut into a new pattern, steadier, complicated, and honest. She still thought of the fraying couch now and then, but not as a wound. She thought of it as evidence that things are repaired and not forgotten. She thought of the attic, the tactile honesty of paint under her nails, and how a simple brushstroke had led her into public life, into community work, into leadership. She had lost a marriage, the easy assumptions of her neighbors, and the social invisibility that had once made her safe in small ways. In their place, she had found something harder,
responsibility, a sense of voice, a role in a collective that could itself press institutions toward light. If this kind of story matters to you, keep watching. It's about real people choosing change. The final pages of Sarah's Winter had no tidy endings, only continuations, a calendar of committee meetings, a recurring volunteer roster, art nights that filled the gym and offered children a sky again. The district's work continued, layered with reports and letters and the slow calculus of policy. The anonymous smears faded into the ledger of memory. The movement they had started did not bring immediate, sweeping reform. What it did do was make it harder for decisions that affected children to be made behind closed doors without being called into daylight. It created pathways for parents to ask, for teachers to speak, and for a community to hold its institutions accountable enough to create change that, while incremental, was real. On the last page of that season, Sarah walked into the attic with a small canvas under her arm and 2 kids at her heels. They climbed the narrow stairs together and breathed in the familiar smell of paint and dust. She gave them brushes and watched as they found their colors, as their small fingers pressed into pigment and made a sky.
She understood, finally, that losing almost everything had not left her barren. It had carved space where something new could grow. The space had not healed by itself. It had been tended by neighbors, by fellow parents, by teachers who risked speaking, by a veteran who kept showing up with a thermos of tea. The story of the town did not end with the ink drying on a single letter from the district. It unfolded in continued conversations, in budgets reviewed in public, in children with paint on their cheeks and hope in their hands. Sarah emerged stronger, not because she had never been vulnerable, but because she had learned to be brave in a way that was communal. She had turned private grief into public duty and had invited others to join the labor. That was the kind of strength that could not be stolen by rumor or reined away. If you believe stories like this matter, stories about neighbors who choose to stand and parents who choose to ask, consider following this channel for more narratives of local courage and everyday resistance. Share this with someone who needs to know that loss can lead to a different kind of life, one repaired, patched, and painted with purpose.